Good evening. Good evening, welcome, and really pleased to see so many of you here. I've got as many wires as something with a lot of wires has, so I hope that I don't come out 4 times and repeat myself endlessly. I'm Jonathan Taylor, I'm the headmaster. That's my only qualification for being here. I'm not Mr. Dimbleby. Little connection there. The Dimblebys, of course, were associated with Quaker schools. Interestingly, the Dimbleby family went to Sidcot, one of our sister-brother schools in Somerset. So that's end of the plug for Quaker schools. We're delighted to have all our prospective parliamentary candidates here. It's wonderful to see friends from other schools as part of the York ISSP, the Independent State School Partnership, of which, this is an event. We're looking forward to an evening where we learn as much as we possibly can. I was just saying to the candidates, we don't know how this will evolve. I'm not, as I say, a Dimbleby. Some of them are very experienced operators. Some of them are relatively inexperienced operators. And I hope in the spirit of the evening we will set about this in good faith. We will try to understand a little bit more about which way we should vote in the coming election, which is going to be the most open election for many years. So we go forward with a little trepidation, but I hope, as I say, in good faith. We're going to begin by allowing each of the candidates to speak for 4 minutes. That's 4 minutes each. We did suggest some signals, that would set off an alarm if they go on for more than 4 minutes. I think you will see a countdown on the screen over there. So if anybody goes on over 4 minutes, you can start going like that, and they will move on. We'll then have some questions, and thank you very much for all the questions you've sent in. We'll start off with the questions that we've got sent in and hope to have some debate around those issues. And we've selected those questions to try and cover what seem to be the main concerns facing us at this election. We've drawn lots to decide who is going to speak in which order, and I've left my piece of paper on the table over there. So somebody, my assistants, thank you very much, will pass it up to me. And yes, the first confusion of the evening, our Green Party candidate is Jonathan Taylor. It's not just me being, Esturine. He is Jonathan Taylor. I am Jonathan Taylor. So let's just get over that confusion. But Jonathan Taylor has drawn the straw, which means that he is going to speak first for 4 minutes. From here, if you would like.
Thank you, Jonathan. A distinctive feature of the Green Party is our determination to address the causes of problems rather than resort to tired cliches and failed nostrums, and always to ensure that policies are based on sound evidence. I want to give you some examples. Air pollution. Some of you may be aware that in recent weeks there's been acute air pollution in Europe. In London, vulnerable people were advised to stay inside. What sort of a system have we got that becomes necessary? So the Green Party, instead of endless studies and feeble measures, would take drastic action to clean up vehicles and cut traffic. Housing. Instead of perpetuating a hopelessly imperfect market, we would cap rents, control buy-to-let, and build many more affordable homes. Road accidents. Why do we tolerate so many deaths and serious injuries on the roads while imposing rigorous safety practices everywhere else? So instead, the Green Party would adopt a raft of policies to slow traffic down and make streets and roads safe for pedestrians and cyclists. Another topic that's been mentioned in some of our earlier debates is mental health, where there is clearly an enormous and growing problem. We welcome, naturally, the recognition of the need to raise the profile of mental health and to spend more on services. But it's surely very important indeed to ask why this is happening, to ask why there is so much unhappiness, and to address the reasons. And of course, this approach is relevant to health generally. Our policies for restoring the national health to its original vision and practice includes a much, much stronger emphasis on prevention as one of the ways of making the service more efficient and more sustainable. There's been a lot of talk about the taxation system and its many unfair features. One in particular that's come to light, and I'm receiving a lot of emails about it, is the so-called Mayfair loophole. This is an extraordinary bit of legislation which allows certain types of private equity activity to pay much less tax than it should be doing on its operations. Our MP introduced an amendment to the finance bill in Parliament yesterday, but the time allowed for debate of a very important finance bill was so short that the amendment was not taken. We shall keep on trying, because that sort of thing must be dealt with. Climate change. Everything we all do must be constrained by the imperative to cut emissions drastically, and we must understand what we are doing. For example, the government is inclined to claim that carbon emissions in this country are going down. But as some of you may have read from a report last week, one of the reasons it's going down is because of the way in which we've exported production, and the carbon emissions of imports are not included in the current way in which the government calculates those factors. That must end. And finally, environmental degradation. When we see threats to the planet's soils, oceans and biodiversity on the present scale, the Green Party is prepared to adopt radical measures, even if it means accepting that present lifestyles are unsustainable.
Thank you very much. Next up, we have Ken Guest from UKIP.
Good evening, everybody. Well, I'm sure you all know the main ambition for UKIP is to lead the UK out of the EU. And you would ask, why do you want to do this? Well, because by leading the EU, we can restore our own democracy in this country, which was badly losing to the EU. We want to regain the control of our own borders and the immigration, and in doing so also save a huge amount of money. Now, UKIP is not alone within Europe. There are many, many other parties throughout the other countries who are also following our path, and they're all gaining in popularity. The main problem with the EU is that we have this lack of democracy. No one's ever actually voted. No country within the Union has actually voted for the presence of the EU. It was just evolved out of previous organisations. And in fact, to the contrary, when 3 referenda were held in France and the Netherlands and Ireland, each of those 3 countries voted against it, but the EU chose to just ignore that and push on. The EU supports uncontrolled immigration, or migration, should we say. Now, we cannot, in this country, plan for our own services when we have no control of immigration at our borders. I don't know if you saw the latest figures for the year to last September, but 624,000 new people arrived in the country in the year, and that's 3 times the population as a whole of York. It's an unmanageable number for 1 year. We have housing shortages, our schools are full, the NHS is at bursting point. We really can't handle this number of people. It's also bringing with it an oversupply of low-skilled or unskilled workers from Eastern Europe. So we would just simply want to introduce an Australian-style system so we can pick and choose who we would allow in. Now, looking at the economies throughout Europe, and bear in mind this is a 60-year programme. The economies, we have Greece, which is virtually bankrupt and is probably about to leave the EU. We have Spain, where youth unemployment is at 45%, and other countries such as Portugal and Italy, which are in a very, very poor state. Even Germany, the powerhouse of Europe, is actually currently in a recession. And the figures ahead show no growth projected in the euro economies for the next 5 years. And the euro itself, of course, the currency, is sinking fast. If you look around the rest of the world, the Commonwealth has an average growth rate of about 7.5%. And other countries like the US and South America, China and the Far East are all rapidly growing. And these are countries that we could be doing business with, and we should be focusing more of our energies in developing trade agreements and business with those. Now, in the 40 years since the UK actually joined the EEC, we've only had a handful of years when we actually made a profit. All the other years we were running in deficit. And that deficit that has built up over successive Labour and Conservative governments. And when the Labour government last left office in 2010, the national debt was £800 billion, big number. Conservatives have been in for 5 years and that number has virtually doubled. So now we have a national debt, £1.5 trillion, £1,500 billion. It's huge, almost too big to imagine. We paid the European Union £55 million a day just for the membership, and we have lots of other regulatory costs which we also incur. So we would want to pull out the EU, and in doing so we would cut all those costs. We'd also cut the £18 billion a year which is costing us for the green energy subsidies, and that equates to about £450 per household energy bill. We'd cut the foreign aid bill back to a reasonable level, and we'd scrap the HS2 railway, which is going to cost something in the order of 50 to 80 billion pounds. We believe that all of this money...
Time is running out.
Yes, sorry. We believe that all that money would be better spent here at home on the NHS, on care for the elderly, on education, defence and other public services. And the alternative to that is we just keep on doing the same thing as we've been doing before, and the debt will continue to increase, and we will be passing that on to the next generation out there, and I think that is totally immoral. We need to take stock and address that debt now. So.
Thank you very much. McElveen is how you pronounce it, I do apologise. Robert McElveen for the Conservatives. I'll really try and look at the watch this time. I'm sorry, this is all too exciting for me. I mustn't listen. I'll just look. Go.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Robert, the Conservative candidate for York Central, and I'm going to try to convince you that the right choice at the general election is to vote Conservative. And that's because I believe this government has got a strong track record and deserves to be re-elected. I'll talk about the economy. You're probably not going to be surprised by that, but we're currently seeing the fastest growth of any country in the developed world. That's not something you could have said when we took office. It's not something you could have said for quite a long time going back over the years, and it's something we should be really proud of. We're coming out of this recession very fast, and as George Osborne said in the budget, Britain's walking tall again. One of the most surprising, in some ways, aspects of this recovery is how many jobs have been created. We actually have the highest employment rate on record, which is not something with all sort of doom and gloom and sort of atmosphere around that people really think about, but it's actually really important. I'm really proud that this government, under this government, 1.85 million more jobs have been created. And we've seen a lot of those jobs in the private sector. For every job that has been removed in the public sector, 5 have been created in the private. And that's actually personally important to me. I finished my studies in 2008, just as the global economy was collapsing, and was unemployed for a couple of months. And I have to tell you, it's one of the most depressing things you could possibly experience. It's really quite soul-destroying. I don't want that to happen to anyone in this room, young or old. And so I urge you to think, what sort of economy do you want to start your careers in? And it's not just about the economy, because the government provides a lot of public services we all rely on. And you can only supply those services if you can generate the tax revenues to pay for them over the long term. So public services really rely on a strong economy. And the economy in the long term also relies on quality public services. It's about striking the balance between them. So we wouldn't, as some members of the panel have said in previous hustings, oppose all cuts. That way you're going to run out of money and you're going to have to impose strict, harsher cuts sooner or later. But also we wouldn't just cut everything, because that way you might starve public services of growth. It's all about striking the responsible balance to get the economy in the right direction for the long term, and then also making sure your public services are reforming to deliver better value for money and also better services. And I think that's what this government has done. I'll leave you with one policy that hopefully some of you might have started thinking about, which is housing. I was a first-time buyer under this government, and I'm really proud of their record in reforming stamp duty to make your first home, or homes at the bottom end of the housing ladder, a lot cheaper, so you pay a lot less tax at one of the most expensive times of your life when you buy your first house and you're paying all the fees. And it's put up the stamp duty a lot at the top end, so the Russian billionaires buying up central London can frankly pay for it. So I'm really proud of that. And also we're taking action to improve supply. Here in York Central, the York Central site by the railway station has recently been announced in the last budget as part of a housing zone. So this is a place where government assists either with help or with technical assistance to bring brownfield sites into use for housing. And actually, one of York's biggest problems is a lack of housing supply. This is a really good way to fix it and to actually use the power of government to really help unlock the potential of that site, which has been sat there for quite a long time. So I'll conclude. This election is a choice. All elections are. And I urge you to choose the Conservative option for a strong economy with reformed public services and a strong positive vision for the future of this city and this country. Thank you.
Thank you. You're on. And now fourth, Rachel Maskell for the Labour Party.
Good evening. Can I thank you for holding the hustings here this evening? It's so great to see so many of you here, because tonight is about you. It's about your future. It's about the kind of country that you want to live in the years ahead. I'm too going to start talking about jobs and the economy, but I'm going to paint a different picture. The Labour Party, Labour, it's in our title. We're about work, good quality work, creating jobs. Labour will end the zero-hour, low-wage economy that we've seen grow so much in the last 5 years and is so dominant here in York. We know that people are struggling, bouncing along the bottom now with their employment, tied to the phone as a zero-hour contracts force them to do so, or else people lose their jobs. In fact, in York, people are losing every year, in real terms, £3,580 out of their wages as fuel, food and rent is going through the roof. Is that really the kind of recovery that you want? We are seeing tax returns fall. So although maybe more people are in work, tax returns are falling, which means less money is coming in to the Treasury. Labour will build an economy, but we'll also build our public services up again. Public services which have been cut and privatised by this government. I have worked in the NHS for over 20 years, and I know the pressures on the system are like they have never been before. The fragmentation that we're seeing, the privatisation that we're seeing of those services, we will lose our NHS if this government returns in May. And therefore I am passionate that we need to save our NHS so it's there to serve us in the future, joining mental health, physical health, social care together as a public service to serve us at those times in our life when we need them. And therefore that will be at the forefront of what I strive for if elected as your MP. But also, we need to look at housing too. In this city, we know there is a housing crisis. We can't afford to buy the houses because we haven't built enough. But also, the rent is going through the roof. With Margaret Thatcher's plan, with Right to Buy, we have seen 26% of our housing now move into the private rented sector. I will be fighting for rent controls to make sure we bring down the cost of housing, but also to make sure our welfare bill doesn't get spent and handed over to the private landlords who are really benefiting from this system. But we'll also make things easier for you, not just looking at house rental issues and management of private landlords, but also looking at your energy bills. We will freeze your energy bills for 2 years and look at reform of the energy sector. And of course, education. Education is what we said in 97 and is what we're putting at the forefront of what we'll be doing in 2015. Looking at how we build an education system for everyone, bringing vocational education into schools, leading into good apprenticeships and jobs, but also looking at degrees again, like they do in Germany, leading education at higher levels and leading it into jobs in the economy. So you have hope at the end of your degree. And of course, we promised and we will cut those tuition fees by £3,000. But that isn't all we're about as Labour. We've always been about the community in which we serve. And I will be a different kind of politician for a different age, building back with you into building your community, listening to your voices, working alongside you, working with the voluntary sector, in restoring our society, building the community back together again so we can have a strong civil society as well as a strong economy and a strong public service. That is what you'll get if you vote Labour in May. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Nick? Well, it's all go, and the next one up is Nick Love for the Liberal Democrats.
Thank you. So, when you vote on May the 7th, there's two key things you're voting for. You're voting for the party, and I believe also you're voting for the person. And let's look at both of them. Well, if you look at the parties, it's almost like promise top trumps. We won't lower that, we won't raise this, we'll cut that. And as someone once said, if we get 1/10 of what was promised in speeches, there will be no inducement to go to heaven. So, if a politician promises you the earth, with Bootham in mind, use it to grow vegetables. So, an MP can only do so much in Parliament. An MP is put there, and he is a member of a political party, and he's there to enact what the party is doing. But also, they have limited power in what they can do. And if he or she is unable to do what they want to do nationally, then they have to do something about that locally. Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't stop people from having beliefs and principles and enacting them, but the sphere of influence is limited compared with what you can achieve in your local constituency. And my belief is that a local constituency MP is worth his or her weight in gold. Whoever you choose on May the 7th will be York's ambassador in Westminster. Not the Labour ambassador, not the Tory, Green, Tusk or Lib Dem ambassador, nor a union ambassador, but York's ambassador. And that's important. So, why do I want to be York's next MP? Well, it's not for personal ambition. I've had a career for over 15 years in logistics supply chain, in the real world. And it's not because I want high office, but it may sound twee and it may sound a bit old-fashioned. Actually, I want to put something back into the town, the city that I've been in since 1985, and I've campaigned in since 1985 with a proven track record. And what I believe is people look at track records as well as promises when they go to that ballot box. So, I'm campaigning on 4 key things. First of all, hasn't been mentioned before, a local council that is fit for purpose. We've got to live here. And the fact is that it should be run for the benefit of residents and the benefit of the people who pay their taxes here, most or a lot of which go to local services, and not for the personal agendas of council managers and ruling politicians. I want a valued local health service, properly staffed and funded, and which can meet the needs of York residents on a daily basis and recognising mental health on an equal footing. A first-class local education from nursery through to 19 and then into higher education or into jobs for young adults moving on with their lives. And also supporting and nurturing thriving local business community. That's important as well. If you've got to work here, and live here, you need a thriving business community that can employ you. So, in short, I can use the massive network of social and business contacts that I've actually built up in York through campaigning over the last 29 years to represent you in the way that you should be enabled to be represented. And that's why I'm putting myself forward and asking for your vote on May the 7th. Thank you.
And finally, in this part of the evening, Megan Ollerhead from the Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition.
Hello, I'm from the Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition. You've probably never heard of us, which is fine, because I'm here to tell you who we are. We are a radical anti-austerity left group, and we're comprised of multiple different left-wing organisations, trade unions, independent socialists, and ordinary people who feel somewhat fed up by the array of policies and options that you've actually had quite handily for me presented before you already. And I'm standing here on behalf of the Trade Unionists and Socialist Coalition because I am one of those people. I'm a student still. So I've been on the sharp end of some of the austerity policies that have been enacted by this government, and I have to say the Labour Party as well, over the past few years. I am terrified for my prospect of getting a job. I am living in a flat which is absolutely draining my admittedly incredibly limited income dry at the moment. And I personally feel like this can't be allowed to carry on. So the reason you haven't heard of us is because we are quite new, but we have formed now because we feel like the things that we have been seeing for the past 5 years and before then cannot be allowed to carry on. So I'll get a bit more concrete there. Our main policies are things like the introduction of a £10 an hour minimum wage. That is a demand put forward by us, by the Trade Unions Congress, and we believe that a city like York would benefit massively from such a wage, because York is obviously, with it being a city of small businesses and massive employers, we believe that massive employers could be made to take the lead in helping to provide small businesses to provide a better living wage for their workers, when often it's difficult. We would introduce state subsidies for that sort of thing. We are interested in nationalisation of key industries and renationalisation of the railways. I'm sure that we know a lot of people here who worked for East Coast who are now having to adjust to being Virgin East Coast, and they are not happy about this decision, having seen what happened to the rest of the railway sector in the hands of various different private companies. We are into nationalisation of the energy companies, which is a demand supported by quite a significant amount of people, actually, if you were contrary to what you might be reading. And we're into free education and full living grants for all, a demand which I also believe is supported by my Green Party colleague on the panel. I should also say at this point that all Tusk candidates standing in this general election, if any of us win, would take no more than the average skilled workers' wage for the region that they will currently be living in. Because I personally feel in a constituency like York, but like many constituencies up and down the UK, we cannot take that full salary while there are people here eating out of food banks to stay alive, while there are people here dying because their benefits are being sanctioned for the tiniest of reasons, and it would be a gross injustice of me to fill my pockets while I am supposed to be representing the good people who live here. We aim to present a real challenge to the lineup this year. Obviously, none of us can quite say what is going to happen in 2015. I was debating this with some of the students before we came out to speak, and none of us know what is going to happen come May the 8th. What are we going to wake up to? Nobody really knows, but I think the fact that we can say that I am here, that UKIP are here, and also that the Greens are here as well, shows that there has been a crisis of quite a radical nature in establishment politics, with the refusal of all three main parties to stop austerity, with the active pursuing of cuts by Labour, by the Tories, by Lib Dems. I think we are looking at a very serious crisis indeed in the nature of establishment politics, and I want to stand in front of you here today and show you that it does not have to be like that if you don't want it to. And realistically, who does? I don't think anyone in here does. Otherwise you wouldn't have come here to listen to what we all have to say for ourselves. Yes, because we're all here tonight because you are interested in what we have to say, and necessarily, you must want to hear something new, something different. Obviously, you're not surprised that it's a socialist standing here giving you the policies that I've just given you, but you will not find it in any of the major media outlets or coming from any of these parties here. So I would
Megan?
like to, so really the reason I'm standing here before you is because I want to say you can make a change, and I would like you to think about the Trade Unionists and Socialist Coalition when you're deciding to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let's, just before we go into questions, let's have a radical sense of where we are. Hands up if you think that our MPs are paid too much money. Hands up if you think that our MPs are not paid enough money. So there you have it. That solves nothing, does it? Wonderful. Okay, we're going to go to questions. We have a question from Daniel Bonser, who is from Huntington School, I think. We have microphones around. Daniel? A microphone will wing its way to you. Speak up loudly, and let's hear the question.
In terms of employment, how would each of you go about improving opportunities for young people in York?
Rachel, that comes to you first.
Right, first of all, what we need to do is ensure that education links into the employment market. At the moment, we segment education from the world of work, and therefore schools should be about getting work ready, as should university. And one of the things that we can learn so much from many of our European countries is that they see that continuum, that higher education actually flows through into jobs and skills and good quality jobs as well. And therefore we need to join up our education system with the employment market. And therefore what Labour will be doing is putting vocational training into schools to ensure that children with academic skills can go in one path, but also if you're better with your hands and in a more practical way, there are other alternatives for you to have good quality apprenticeships at the end of that, which leads you into, obviously, a good job for the future. With regards to higher education, personally, I believe we need to completely review higher education. See it as a public service. That's what it's there for. And therefore, to ensure that I don't think you should pay for that. It should come out of general taxation. But therefore, lead through to free people up to study to the right level and then to feed into the employment market. So that's where I believe we need to do, making the connections back again.
Thank you. Robert?
Thank you. Good question. There are several different things we can do to make sure that all young people have the opportunities they need. One of the things I'm most proud of in York is that the number of students trying the, or attempting the English Baccalaureate, which is the sort of core subject of GCSE, has I think more than doubled in terms of who's trying it, and almost doubled in terms of who's teaching it. And it's really important that standards in schools equip all students with those basic skills that absolutely everyone needs to succeed. I'll pick up on Rachel's point on apprenticeships. I'll be fair also, under the Labour government they modernised the apprenticeship scheme, and this government, Conservative and Lib Dem, has delivered I think 2.2 million apprenticeships, which is a huge expansion. We've committed to deliver 3 million more if we're elected next time. So it's something that I'm really keen on, and I think is a key way to make sure that all young people have the opportunity, whether they go to university or not. The basic bedrock, though, of opportunity is an economy into which the businesses are growing, people are hiring, and keeping it on the right path in terms of the economic progress we're already seeing under this government is absolutely critical to make sure that there are opportunities for everyone who can compete to take, and hopefully opportunities for everyone.
Nick, do you have a particular view on how we would go about improving opportunities for York's young people in terms of employment?
Yeah, and that's the key. It's York's young people. What you need to, I mean, obviously there has been in the past a tendency to push people from, or incentivise people to go from education into university. And one of the things that we've done as a coalition is create, obviously, over 2 million apprenticeships, and we would, like all the other parties, more than double the apprenticeships. Other things that we would do that are part of party policy, we would cut 2/3, or we would reduce 2/3 off bus travel for young people. So what we would make it is, first of all, easy to go for interviews, or should I say cheaper to go for interviews, and more importantly, cheaper to get to work. So what we do is reduce the burden. And then what we would do is we would build on what we've done for businesses in York. I was with the Federation of Small Businesses earlier this week, who make up, 12 million employees work for small businesses. And as a government, we've reduced corporation tax from 23 to 20%. We've introduced an employees allowance, small business rate relief. enterprise investment, seed investment, and businesses with less than 50 employees are exempt from new regulations. So what you've got to do is you've got to have a vibrant economy and, more importantly, a vibrant jobs market locally, which will enable young people to be employed and actually to have a future.
Do we have anybody in the audience who wishes to contribute at this stage on employment opportunities in York? We have somebody in the front row here. Can we have a mic? No, we need a mic for people to hear. Somebody with a mic, please. Thank you. So we need sustainable, well-paid work, especially for young people. How about our trade union colleague?
Well, okay, you mentioned zero-hour contracts there in particular. Obviously, young people do make up the bulk of, people employed on those things. And personally, I would love to see a flat-out end to the 0 hours contract, because there are, you can be flexible on a contract without it being 0 hours, because the real problem with 0 hours, it denies you holiday pay, it denies you sick pay, it denies you a lot of rights at work that you would be entitled to if you had a fixed amount of hours on your contract. So me personally, I would love to see an outright banning of the 0 hours contracts, and which hopefully then would force employers to take on, young people with sensible hours and giving them stuff that, an income they can actually sort of rely on, even if it is just a part-time job while you're at college. And obviously what I was saying about the £10 an hour minimum wage stuff earlier, I'll go back to this, plug, is we would obviously look to, a sort of transitional state subsidy to help employers manage, because obviously I would never ever say, right, wake up on May the 8th, right, you're all paying £10 an hour now, you're going to have to lay off all your staff, you're going to have to do this, you're going to have to cut, the number of employees you've got on your books. We would, dip into local funds to help businesses manage that. So hopefully we could, start bringing a decent, meaningful wage to people on that as well in the city centre, which would be quite nice. And also, sort of on a national level, I would like to see government investment in companies that want to take on young people. I'd love to see a rise in the national apprenticeship minimum wage, because it's something like £2.65 an hour, which is absolutely outrageous for anyone thinking of going on an apprenticeship in the room. But things like, I'd love to see the government investing in arts programmes, because obviously what happens is when a lot of university graduates, come out, I'm coming out of uni with an English literature degree, and I am terrified of this jobs market, because nobody wants to employ arts graduates, because it's the STEM subjects that are receiving all the investment. So I would love to see a government programme investment into, arts and humanities and sort of social sectors as well, which I think would open up a lot of doors to young people who are looking for work, personally.
Thank you very much. I wonder if the Green Party is going to intervene as heavily as the Tusk Party is going to in terms of job creation or in looking after employment for young people.
I think what we need to do is to look at the overarching issues here. Naturally, we share some of the ideas that have been commented on so far. But the fact is that we're currently living in a globalized economy, which essentially means a race to the bottom in terms of employment and the wages and salaries that are paid. There is a vast number of people in the world who will work for far less than people in this country. We are completely open at the moment to that activity. In order to sustain the globalized economy, we have to go on producing and producing and consuming and consuming. We cannot do that. This is a finite planet. We are destroying the environment, and we are consuming materials in a way that is simply unsustainable. Whenever you hear this word sustainable, look carefully. In many cases, it's an idle word with little meaning. The real fact is that the current global economy and our way of life is unsustainable. That's the way in which the Green Party would address this issue, is to recognise that and start rebuilding local economies where is a much better chance of creating good jobs and a satisfying life. And one of the most obvious ways of doing that is a mass program of insulating buildings. That would make a huge difference to our carbon emissions, and it creates many high-quality jobs because of the skills involved.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to the next question, and Ken, you're going to lead on this one, but you may want to talk about employment as well, because it may well be overlapping. The question is from Heidi Fraser-Krauss. Could we see Heidi, please? And can somebody bring her a microphone?
Okay, so do you believe immigration is a benefit or a curse?
I was going to ask for one-word answers, but that may be a bit cruel, mightn't it? It would be interesting to see who can give us a succinct answer on do you believe immigration is a benefit or a curse? Sir.
No, it won't be a succinct answer. One thing we must make clear, UKIP is not opposed to immigration and never has said that much. We would encourage immigration. Immigration has always taken place into this country over many, many years, hundreds of years. But when we go back pre-1997, the immigration level was around about 40 to 50,000 people a year, maybe, and that was sustainable. We could bring those people in, and they could find work, etc. When Labour opened the doors in '97 and a little bit later, this surged up to an average of 300,000 net immigration. And as I said in my speech earlier, 600,000 new people arriving in 1 year. That becomes a very difficult thing to manage. So I think the answer really is that we would like to see immigration return to sensible levels, probably round about the tens of thousands, 50,000, as it used to be, and then we can plan for those people coming into the country. We'll be able to manage them in terms of housing them, providing schools for their children and all this, the rest of the health service. Rather than being, at the moment, many communities around the country feel swamped by it. We don't see it so much here in York. It's not a major immigration problem here in York. But down the eastern side of the country, in the rural areas and some of the big cities, they are seeing that. They're seeing it in the schools with getting the children into schools. So it's a mixed. I think it just needs to come back to a sensible level where we can better select the people and not be so. At the moment, we're kind of discriminating against people who are coming from outside the EU. Australians, for instance, they have to get a work visa to come here. Anyone from the EU can walk in, regardless of their qualifications and whether we need them. But people from other countries, which were former Commonwealth countries, or even the United States or Australia, they have to get visas. So we're discriminating against them, and we shouldn't be doing that.
Thank you. If that's a succinct answer, do heaven help us. Rachel, I wonder if the Labour Party feel they took their eye off the immigration ball in the last Parliament.
The reality is we're a country of immigrants, and throughout our history we have seen different waves of immigration, and we have to, I think, change the context of the debate around immigration today. If we look at net migration, look at the people coming in but also leaving our country, and understand the reasons and the rationale for that. One of the main reasons people are coming here at the moment is because we've got skill shortages. And why is that? It's because we aren't putting the training in place. I look at the NHS and what's happening around the skill shortage in the NHS as we go out and take nurses out of Spain and Portugal and beg them to come into our country and work here. It's because it's getting more and more difficult in a fragmented NHS to actually train nurses. And we know that's the same for medics as well. And therefore, moving forward, unless we address some of the crisis in our workforce planning, we are going to see even more immigration. And we saw that around when in the construction industry, around bringing people with the skills in order to build our economy before. So most people think about the debate with regards to the pressure on our benefit system. I have to just remind you that more people who travel overseas, claim benefit overseas than actually do coming into the UK. It's very minimal. Most people are here paying their taxes, working in our country, and bringing huge cultural assets to our country as well. And therefore, I want to change the context of the debate and then to talk about what we need to do to ensure that there is good quality jobs that enables people to go from education into jobs and from current unemployment into jobs as a real priority. But we've got to clamp down, and this is one of the main things that we've got to focus on these bogus agencies who are setting up employment agencies to undercut British jobs. And nothing has happened over the last few years, and that is one of the first things Labour will do, is to clamp down on these bogus employers, which is where the real debate around immigration is being fuelled.
Nick. That was exciting. That's the first round of applause. Well done. Let's do that more often. That sounds good. Nick Love, I wondered who you were going to clamp down on.
We're going to clamp down, actually, on the lack of border checks. One of the things that we're not, and actually we can't say, is how many people have actually come into the country and how many, more importantly, have exited the country. So that's one of the things that we want to tighten up on. HMRC, for instance, have been complaining for an awful long time about themselves being short-staffed. So with regards to what we want to clamp down on, it's that. With regards to whether it's a benefit or a curse, to answer the question, it's undoubtedly been a benefit, and many professions within the UK wouldn't function properly without the skilled immigrants coming into the country actually to fill those positions. So, and let's take some of the spin out of this as well. Out of benefit fraud, immigrants actually account for just 4% of benefit fraud. So again, let's not demonise people. Let's make sure that we have an integrated society, and let's make sure, obviously, that we have proper checks and balances to make sure that what we don't get is a big, in effect, immigration problem with regards to illegal immigrants, and have a thriving market and a job market for those who want to come over and work and fill key positions.
Robert, I wonder if you know what the net migration figure was for last year for the UK? I'm only asking you that with some confidence because I've got a figure here being tweeted through to me on the screen. So the net migration figure for the UK last year, anybody want to have a go? Oh, have a go. 298,000. That's the figure I got on the screen, so well done. There's a hole in one. 298,000 net migration figure.
330,000.
There we go. We are tweeting through the evening, and the hashtag to use when you tweet is Bootham Debates. Hashtag Bootham Debates. I wonder if we could go back to the questioner. There is a clue perhaps in the name, Heidi Fraser Krauss. What's your thoughts on immigration, a curse or a, whatever you said, a curse or a benefit? Do you feel that our politicians are addressing this properly?
Okay, so first of all, I'm not an immigrant at all, despite my name, though I am married to one. Okay, I think immigration is a definite benefit to the UK, and I'm very pleased I live in an open and tolerant society like the UK.
Shall we move on? You may say something, of course.
Yes, I hope we never use the word curse. I'm sure you're using it rhetorically, but I think we need to avoid that. I share a lot of what Rachel said in general policy, but I do want to make one point, and that is that I don't think anybody has mentioned that there are a number of quite different reasons for immigration, and we need to have appropriate policies for each type of immigration. We need to look at asylum seekers and the reasons why they are coming, why people are coming. We need to look at the whole problem of economic migration, which relates to what I was saying earlier about the nature of the global economy. We need actually to consider climate change, because the more climate change goes on in the way it's going on at the moment, the more economic migration there is going to be, which is why I think UKIP is quite wrong to talk about reducing the development aid budget. We need to understand, to look more carefully at what Europe is about and why the policy of the open market for labour is such a central feature of the European vision, and whether in fact there are ways in which perhaps it could be modified. But the overall point is to think more, that I'm trying to make, is to think more deeply about the various different reasons and not to lump everybody together as immigrants and begin to demonise them, which is what's so unacceptable.
Thank you. Let's move on. Julie Shires has a question for us.
Hello.
Sorry, where's... Oh, there you are. Sorry.
This is my question. Why are welfare cuts that target the most vulnerable in our society more palatable than tax increases when dealing with the deficit?
Must be one of the key questions. Robert, would you like to address that?
You do need both. And actually, we've seen this government has raised taxes. It's actually also raised the share of tax paid by the top earners by designing the tax rates to basically harvest them as efficiently as possible, but without harming growth rates. You can see it, I talked earlier about stamp duty, and the top rate of stamp duty went for up to 15% under this government for extremely expensive properties. And people actually continue to pay it, which was a bit of a surprise because it was meant to be tackling avoidance. Welfare cuts. It's the motive issue, and one of the main policies of this government is to actually simplify and improve welfare through the introduction of universal credit. It's difficult and complicated because our welfare system is horrendously complicated, and anything involving the level of complexity that's built up over many decades in our welfare system is really hard to unpick. So there are really sad and tragic cases where people who shouldn't have been sanctioned have been. That doesn't necessarily mean the concept of sanctions are necessarily wrong, but we do necessarily need to keep looking at whether we can have mechanisms by which we can use a bit more human common sense, actually, in the job centre, because there's a lot of almost sort of computer says no attitude, which is really unhelpful. One of the other things I'd like to talk about in terms of welfare for vulnerable people is this government's been trying, although it's difficult, and in the context of a challenging recession, even more difficult, to try to ask people who've been on incapacity benefit, what work can you do? Not just saying you can't work, here's a benefit. Now, for some people, that's not appropriate because they can't necessarily work, and this is part of the policy that I think Labour did the groundwork on with Atos. It's been difficult, and the contract hasn't necessarily worked as well as it has been, but the principle of saying to someone, what work are you able to do, not just saying you can't work, here's incapacity benefit for the rest of your life, I think has to be the right one. But you're right, it has been difficult to implement.
Who feels, straw poll, that the present government has got the pressure on the poor too strong in comparison with the pressure on the rich? That's quite interesting, isn't it? That's a simplified straw poll. Megan, your view on welfare cuts that target the most vulnerable in our society. Are they more palatable than tax increases?
Do I even need to open my mouth? Right.
Okay, let's move on.
No, I will speak. Obviously, with respect to you as my fellow panel member, I don't agree with you at all. It may be all very well, the tax raises that you've implemented and so on and so on, but it still doesn't change the fact that almost nobody is really feeling this recovery that we keep talking about. It really doesn't. I alluded to this in my earlier speech. People are dying because they're waiting to have their incapacity benefit assessed or reassessed. People are committing suicide because they've had their benefits stopped erroneously or through some piece of legislation that has been drafted in to make them even, sanctions and stuff even tighter than they already have been. While at the same time there is still an enormous amount of wealth concentrated in this country in private hands, which is flying out of the UK because of the massive tax loopholes that still exist. And because, there are, I think it's 750 billion of stagnant capital right now that this country's major investors are sitting on. It's because they don't want to invest, because this country's economy is in crisis. So they have the capacity to put these funds back in and make it easier for people to find work, to stimulate the economy again. But they just won't do it because they are scared of putting their money into a system which is not working for anybody. And you don't really need me to carry on.
Okay, thank you.
Much further, but I think it's absolutely important.
Rachel, the welfare system is ludicrously complex. How can the audience believe that you will be better able as a Labour Party, as a Labour government, to tackle the problem than the Conservatives have been?
What we have to do when we talk about welfare is go back to basic principles of what our welfare state is about. And ultimately, it's about supporting people to live a quality of life. And it's a judgment of different governments of what quality actually means. Labour increasing paternity pay and paternity leave if we get elected in May. We increase maternity leave, parental leave. We have given parents more opportunities as a result of that. We look at people living longer and therefore securing people in their old age through a good state pension. That is welfare, and it's important that we do protect people across our economy. And therefore, it's not anybody's fault if they lose a job or they can't find work. And yet they're being punished and therefore really having to struggle to get by. And things like sanctions introduced into the benefit system, where perhaps you only apply for 12 jobs in a week instead of 15, and therefore you are penalised for a number of weeks and don't get the benefits you should, is a cruel system, and therefore we have to reform it, and Labour will reform it. And part of the reform will be to grow jobs, to introduce controls over the way people are treated at work and better employment rights, putting that forward. But also we will tackle our economy by looking at things like tax avoidance, unpaid tax and tax evasion, £120 billion worth of money that we could bring back into our economy. One thing that we truly do believe is that we won't just slash welfare, as we heard in the budget last week, £12 billion being cut from welfare, which is totally unsustainable. That's £12 billion being taken out of the pockets of the most vulnerable people in our society, and therefore making people struggle even more. And therefore Labour will look at a fair economy, one that obviously supports and helps and tries to help people back into work, but also one that protects and safeguards people in the time when they really need that in their lives.
Nick, do you think that the Liberal Democrats have done enough in coalition with welfare reform?
We've done what we can, and what we've tried to do is make a positive influence. I mean, page 1 of our manifesto at the last election was to raise the tax threshold, and it's going to be 11,000. That was implacably ridiculed and opposed initially by the Conservatives, but I'd like to think that we've actually persuaded them that that's a really positive thing, because they're now including it in the manifesto for the next election. We've also had a pupil premium. So what we've done is we've actually put money into schools with disadvantaged pupils or pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds to try and obviously shorten and compress the learning gap between those and those with obviously, with families with incomes. What we've done as well is our manifesto says for the next election that we are actually going to ask those who earn more actually to pay some more tax. And that's some targeted taxes on those who earn more, but it's also about using taxes to attack where there are loopholes and where people, it's a bit of an irony that people that earn the most can afford to pay their accountants to actually help them keep more of their income, which I think is wrong. So what we will be doing is taxing private pensions relief, shares for rights and dividends tax. So we will be asking those who earn more to pay more to help those, obviously, who can't afford to get onto the employment ladder and then to contribute to society.
Thank you very much. Any comments from the floor on this area? Yes. Do we have a microphone, please? Whiz. Speedy mic.
Hello. I would just like to ask the Labour candidate how she sees her party could sustain employment opportunities for people that are disadvantaged who are on benefits and come into the workplace, being that the sickness absence and the problems of keeping people in jobs is quite paramount at the moment. How do you propose to sustain employment for people, say, for instance, with mental health problems who struggle to maintain attendance at work?
Well, the way that we need to address that is ensuring that we've got fair employment rights, because I've worked as a trade union official for many years and worked with people particularly who have experienced stress at work and been bullied at work. And we know that the workplace is quite an intolerable place and people do not have fair opportunity. And therefore what we need to ensure is that the worker does have rights and the employer has to apply flexibility to accommodate people with mental health problems who perhaps need to attend work later in the day and need the flexibilities built around them. And one of the things that I particularly looked at and fought here in York was to keep Remploy open, which sadly this government shut down, because Remploy provided a safe environment for people to work. It was a sheltered work environment for people to work in, real skilled jobs, which they just slashed to disabled people. It was a safe environment for people to live out their lives and have confidence in the work that they do. And then they moved into mainstream employment, the few that actually got jobs as a result, bullied out of the workplace. And therefore, the things that Labour will do is look at how do we protect workers in the workplace and particularly remove discrimination and to have hard sanctions. I just want to add, to take a discrimination claim now, because of the decisions of this Tory Lib Dem government, has been to put up employment tribunal fees to such an extent that people who are being discriminated against cannot afford to go and take their case to court. It's an outrage.
There were some more hands up. More hands up in the audience. Can I take one more? Gentleman in the purple shirt.
Been a lot of talk about welfare lately on the press. What about corporate welfare? What about welfare, the billions that have been paid out, bailing out the banks and keeping the financial sector alive? What about the billions paid to CEOs and corporate multinationals who aren't paying tax? What about the trillions of pounds, never mind billions, in offshore tax havens that this Conservative government is aiding, is helping, has passed legislation to facilitate? What has been done about that?
Thank you very much. Would you like to take that, Robert, and then we'll come to you?
This government has been tackling tax avoidance, certainly when you look at and tax evasion. When you look at the deal with Switzerland that this government did to open up Swiss bank accounts, is a good example of the practical stuff you can do. In terms of what was I going to say? In terms of tax, Peter Mandelson very famously once said he was intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich. This has been a long-term problem under the previous Labour government as well. It's always been a challenge to make sure that people are paying tax they legally have to, and you should always look at making sure that loopholes that exist and are exploited are closed, but you can't just go around saying to someone, I think you should have paid more tax if legally they haven't broken the law. It's not, you have to change the law rather than going around saying, I want your money. So it's not...
Jonathan, do you think that we've been too lenient with the bankers and with large corporations?
Much too lenient. The Conservative Party is ideologically incapable of taking seriously the growing gap in wealth and income between the tiny minority who are extremely rich and getting richer and the rest of us. When the Conservative government came into power, unfortunately with Lib Dem support in 2010, they seized on what they thought was a crisis, and they decided that they were going to use it as the opportunity to enforce their ideology. They focused on the deficit. Many economists cannot understand why there is this obsession with the deficit. We have lived with a deficit of that sort of size for years and years and years. And as Will Hutton pointed out in The Observer on Sunday, his previous generation never even talked about it. It was not a problem. But it was used as the reason for cracking down, as they see it, on welfare. They decided that they were going to focus their efforts on the most vulnerable, and they were going to let the rich get away with it. Robert talks of measures that have been taken. They are trivial compared with the size of the problem. The Green Party is absolutely clear that we are going to do everything we can to close down the tax havens, to close the loopholes, the innumerable loopholes in the taxation of companies and individuals, and to raise the tax to very much higher levels than it currently is in place on the rich. And when you hear people say, but the rich will go elsewhere, hooey, and in many cases, I don't actually think that it would matter if they left.
My source tells me that by 2016, the richest 1% in the world, will own more than everybody else. Let's move on. Can we move on to the next question? This really is, it should just have a yes-no answer. Let's see how we go with this. Ferdy Holly, please. Is Ferdy here from All Saints? There's a microphone winging its way.
Thank you. So, in light of the Scottish referendum and the number of young people in the room, where do you stand on lowering the voting age to 16?
Ken, would you like to start? We'll move along the panel and see how quickly we can get from one end to the other.
We were chatting about this in the anteroom before I came in with some of your students, and we agreed that, I personally think it's probably at the moment in this country a little bit too low, because not so many of the 16-year-olds across the country in schools are engaged in politics within school. And I think that is increasing, and certainly a few schools that I visited here in York, the youngsters are engaged in taking political courses, so they would be tuned into it. But
perhaps they're not engaged because they're not allowed to be engaged if they haven't got a vote.
Indeed. It's true. It's a difficult one to balance.
Okay, so you're standing on the fence nicely. That's good.
Yes.
Honest. Megan?
Do it. Make political education in schools compulsory, but at the same time, do it.
Nick, should the youngsters be looking to you for a vote?
Yes, and unequivocally, they should be voting at 16. What it will do is it will engage people like it did in Scotland, and what it will mean as well is that the politicians have to take young people seriously.
Oh, no. Oh. Is there a Labour Party policy on this?
There is.
Tell me what it is.
And Labour have committed that if we are elected and in government in May, we will be reducing the voting age to 16. We need to reconnect young people back into the political system. We saw how successful that was in Scotland, with people really engaged in the issues. After all, you're going to be stewards of this planet for longer than any of us on this table. So absolutely, 16.
The Green Party has had this policy for some time and would therefore implement it if we had the slightest chance, perhaps in support of Labour.
Could be a deal breaker.
I congratulate the schools that are developing interest in politics. I was at the Questioner School with some of the colleagues here last week, where there was considerable interest, and the turnout tonight is magnificent. I would add one thing, and that is there's not a great deal of point in voting within the present system of election. So a necessary part of a change is some form of proportional representation, as arises in Europe, in Scotland, in London, and it's about time we had it here, and I hope the Labour Party... I hope the Labour Party will get away from its tribal objection to fair voting.
Robert. It was 16 was the question.
I'm going to give you a brave answer.
Oh.
Recently, the age of buying cigarettes was raised from 16 to 18. At 16, you can get married, but only with the permission of your parents. You can join the army, but you can't fight on the front line, and you can't drive till you're 17. There has to be an age, or at least under our present system, there has to be an age, and I think 18 is not totally inappropriate. I think that I would probably choose to stick with that. From personal experience, I missed out voting on the 1999 European elections by a single day, and if I'd been living in France, Germany, or many other European countries, I would have had a vote. So I understand how annoyed people can be when they can't vote. But to come back to Nick's comment, you can actually take people seriously when they might not be able to vote for you as well.
Complicated issue here. I want those who are over... how many people are under 18 in the room? Put your hands up. Of those people who are under 18, who wants to vote? Who thinks that they're too young to vote? Okay. Of those who are... This is really difficult. It's stretching my brain capacity. Those of you who are old, i.e. over 18, who wants... hands up if you're over 18. And how many of you want 16-year-olds to vote? Keep your hands in the air. So put your hands up again if you're over 18. Over 18, hands up. Hands down. I just couldn't see. You're moving too quickly. Hands down if you... It's too complicated to bother with. Very good. Let's move on. Our next question comes from Andrew Hall. Andrew Hall, please. Somewhere in the room. Andrew is there. A microphone is coming your way.
Thank you. Given the likely number of SNP MPs in the next Parliament, should the powers of devolution given to Scotland be matched by the equal removal of such rights from MPs outside of England when voting on English-only matters?
It's almost as complicated as my last voting ploy, isn't it, that one? It's the West Lothian question. Where shall we turn to? UKIP, would you like to have a word on the West Lothian question for us, please?
A word, yes.
Oh, that was the word. Right.
Thank you.
Of course they should be prohibited from doing it, yes.
Nick Love.
I think Alex Salmon, and now obviously Nicola, are playing a very clever game here. And I find it a bit distasteful in the fact that what they're doing is they're politicking, and what they're saying is if we get enough MPs, we in effect can make sure that we get control in effect of Westminster, so that England may well dislike us so much they'll want us to have go our own way anyway. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a bit of an invidious position. I do believe that we should have English MPs voting on English laws.
Thank you. Rachel?
This is really a question about devolution and where devolution goes in the future. And since the 1970s, we've seen increasing centralisation of power and resource to national governments. And I believe it's time that we turned the tide on that and really brought money and power down to local government to be able to connect up the services within a local community under a national framework in order to best serve the community in which the local authority is based. And therefore, I very much support devolution. You may say that's strange about somebody wanting to go to Westminster to then bring resources locally, but I think York would really thrive if we're able to connect education with health, with housing, and join those agendas, the environment, join those agendas together to make it work for us. So I really do support a devolution agenda.
And where would a power base be for the region of Yorkshire, Humberside? Where would we be able to feel we were being represented?
Well, at the moment, we're part of the West Yorkshire Combined Authority, 6 authorities being joined together there under a structure York in itself isn't a big enough lever in order to bring in economic regeneration, and therefore we do need to join up with other local authorities for the infrastructure, of looking at transport, to looking at some of the big questions facing our economy. And therefore, at the moment, that's where our relationship sits, and obviously we need to look at how we bring a democratic process to support that.
Robert, the Tories have been talking about, rather belatedly perhaps, regenerating the north and establishing some devolved power to the north. Can you talk us through that and how you think that might benefit us in York?
Sure. George Osborne talks a lot about the Northern Powerhouse. You're probably already fed up with the phrase, but it's quite an important idea that the rebalancing the economy, instead of balancing down the areas that are currently very wealthy and successful, you try to develop those areas which are to some extent punching below their weight economically. And in the north, in particular, transport is a huge issue. It takes a long time to get from Manchester to Leeds, longer than it should do for the distance. And so long-term investments in rail in the north, so for instance, the Northern Hub was confirmed under this government and is proceeding. George Osborne likes to talk about High Speed 3, which is a bit cheeky because it's actually not going to be high speed because they're too close together to be properly high speed. But it's a really strong signal that actually if you fix the infrastructure around an economy, you can then really grow it. And there's no point having a country where you've got London and the southeast, very wealthy, and then the rest of the country is sort of suffering in relation to that. So what you need to do is try and grow the capacity of the economy in the north of England, whether it's Liverpool, Hull, York in particular. And I was slightly struck by Rachel's slightly odd comment about York not being big enough to sort of almost succeed, because each city is a different place. York isn't a suburb of Leeds, despite the sort of Labour's council taking us into the West Yorkshire Combined Authority, despite us not being in West Yorkshire. And it's a really strong environment of its own place. It's got fantastic transport links long distance to London and to Edinburgh, and it's also the sort of rural, the capital for the rural economy around North Yorkshire as well. So I think York is plenty big enough to thrive in its own niche and under its own steam. And everywhere in the north has to sort of find its own place. Economies thrive when they have something about them that they can do really well and they can do better than anyone else. And every city has to find that to succeed.
Thank you very much. Who feels optimistic about the future for a loosely defined area called the North? Oh dear.
People don't know what it means.
Well, people might not know what it means. I think you know what it means. How many people are feeling optimistic about the future for York, given the current state of devolved power? It's not very good, is it? A very quick comment and then we must move on.
As a transport economist and planner, I'm not convinced that building a railway that won't open until 2035 is going to do very much for the northern economy. But leave that aside. The question was actually about Parliament and so-called English votes for English matters. The Green Party is simply not interested in short-term so-called solutions to the alleged problems. We would take a step back because clearly this country faces a constitutional crisis which we've been putting off addressing for far too long. We let the Scotland referendum creep up on us, and we were and that led into the current situation. We need to think carefully about the future structure of the whole United Kingdom, and that means in our view, some form of federalism. The dreaming in the Green Party, we sometimes talk about Iona, the islands of the North Atlantic, and hoping to bring in the whole of the island of Ireland as well into some sort of federation or confederation. We just need to start thinking about solutions, and that would include, incidentally, the so-called English votes for English matters is extremely messy administratively and probably would fall apart and just add to the problems. But we believe that we must step back and that there should be a constitutional convention involving many more than just politicians.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's just move on so that
Just one short comment.
very quickly.
I think with the referendum in Scotland, the way Labour played it towards the end really got in and riled an awful lot of SNP people, as we saw afterwards, and their membership soared. After this election, we're going to see 40-odd SNP MPs in Westminster, and they will be stirring things up and wittering about the Scottish situation. And I predict that maybe within the year, if we don't go to a re-election, people will be so fed up of people like Alex Salmond down there in Westminster wittering about the Scottish issue that everybody will have wished that they got the referendum, won it in the first place, and they'll probably get another one. So it's all played into their hands.
Let's move on to, I hope we can get 2 more questions in if we're quick. Evan Shelton has a question. Can we just get you a mic, Evan, please? It's just coming.
If the UK left the European Union, how do you think Britain, or more particularly York, would actually be affected?
Okay, so can we be as succinct as we can? Sorry to press you, but it'd be nice to get one more question in. If the UK left the European Union, how do you think Britain, or more particularly York, would be affected? Ken?
Well, York, along with the rest of Britain, would benefit, simply because we would save so much money, and that will feed back into our own economy.
Megan?
Oh, Christ. Just one last simple point. On the trading side of things, people say, oh, we'll lose this access to the European market in trading. It's complete rubbish. We buy things from them, they buy things from us. That's business, and it will continue. It might be interesting to know that during the last year, the UK ran a £60 billion deficit with the other 27 members of the EU. So we're really not getting the best end of the deal.
Megan?
It's not a decision to be taken lightly, leaving the EU. I think the consequences of Britain leaving the EU would be absolutely enormous, and I think it would take a little bit of time before those consequences fully settled, before we could be presented with a complete and accurate picture of what the situation for York and Britain at large would actually be. But the one thing I can certainly say is Britain would have a whole host of new decisions to make, and it might present a fresh opportunity for the British people to start thinking about how they want to organise their own kind of lives in terms of employment and things like that. So it could be a potentially very interesting situation, but I'm not sure exactly what it would look like.
Nick?
Well, the Lib Dems are always portrayed as evangelical Europeans, and actually we're not. If you look at the manifesto, for instance, what we want to do in the next European Parliament is not have 2 parliaments and scrap Strasbourg, and that would actually save European taxpayers $150 million a year. So the point about it is, if you want to influence Europe, you've got to be in it. And you've got to be in there fighting for UK jobs and for other issues. And what you can't do is you can't exclude yourself, and you can't actually be a cocoon and then expect to have influence in Europe if you're not in it.
Thank you. Rachel?
It would have a devastating impact both on Britain and York if we withdrew from the EU. We have 3.5 million jobs dependent on our membership of the EU, and that brings £30 billion into our economy. If we stopped playing on the edges of Europe and took Europe seriously and actually got fully involved in Europe and came to the centre of Europe in a more integrated world, then of course that will even grow our economy and help employers to invest back into our economy. So I believe in an ever-connected world we need to be part of Europe at the centre of it, but also if we're looking at our global dynamic, how we address climate change, how we address foreign affairs, if we're part of a wider peace-building bloc, an influential bloc, we can have far more leverage over the rest of our global situation.
Jonathan, you're talking about devolution within Europe or without Europe?
Yeah, yes. I'm going to use the immortal phrase, I agree with Nick, in the sense of reminding us that the leaving Europe is a practical nonsense as well as an issue of ideology, because so much of our trade is with Europe. We would have to continue to be subject to European legislation, without having direct influence over it. You ask a Norwegian, they suffer from this problem, and so do the Swiss.
Okay, can we...
Sorry, I do
if you
must
agree
say
with Nick, we've heard it twice.
No, there's another aspect to it. The Green Party is in favour of a referendum about Europe, but only after there has been deep discussion about the way Europe is heading, because it's been taken over once again by the rich corporate interests. We want a people's Europe.
Okay. You can see all sorts of political bargaining going on when the different parties are represented in Parliament, can't you? It's going to be fascinating. Robert.
Well, weirdly, I'm going to go even further across the ideological spectrum and agree with Megan. It actually entirely depends on what you do when you leave. And the Norwegian solution, as Jonathan mentioned, is basically worse than where we are now. The Swiss solution is pretty messy, and we'd have to be really radical in terms of how we would reform ourselves. There was actually a study out last week, I think, by the think tank Open Europe that did a projection of how Britain might succeed sort of 20 years down the line if we leave. And actually, the impact is remarkably small given the cataclysmic predictions. And that's because things like Rachel's 3.5 million jobs. Mine's actually one of them, by the way. But it's not true that 3.5 million jobs would disappear if we left the EU, because the trade would continue. It's been a lie that's been put out by the pro-European side for so long. It just keeps getting bigger, and also it's just not true, because if you abolished all trade with Europe, yes, it would be a disaster, but we're not. No one is doing that, and no one. It wouldn't be a practical outcome of leaving the EU at all. I think it's a really scaremongering to say that. It would change our relationships with them. It might change it for the better, it might change it for the worse, but it's unknown. On a final point, the Conservatives are not campaigning to leave Europe, we're campaigning to reform it. And what we need to do is to actually make a Europe that we all see the benefit of, and that's by reducing regulation where it doesn't need to exist. It's by making sure that we complete the single market. So at the moment, goods and labour can move pretty freely within the EU, but services and energy and other parts of the economy are not fully traded in the single market, and it's a huge missed opportunity. So we want to make Europe work, make work better, but if not, we do have the option to leave, and we'll have a referendum in 2017 if we do have a majority.
YouGov, sorry, clap if you want to clap, sorry. Let me not stifle the claps. YouGov Sun poll this week says that 46% of the UK would vote to stay in the EU, 36% would vote to leave. Hands up if you'd vote to leave the UK. You say...
No one.
If you'd vote to leave the EU. Okay, and those who'd vote to stay, there may be some who are undecided. One or two undecided. That's interesting. Okay, we are rapidly reaching the end of the evening. I've got one more question, which is from Chris Wood. Please, Chris Wood, a question, a mic.
How important is it that a candidate is an established resident and has experience of all corners, life and everyday issues of the community and the constituency that he or she seeks to represent?
Okay, good testing question. There's no wriggle room on this one. Hands up, panel members, if you have been resident in York for 10 years or more. Do we need to go further? How important is it, Nick, this evening?
Talking to people on the doorsteps, it's hugely important. You're saying, I would say that, wouldn't I? But why shouldn't I? Actually, if you have got a track record, people talk about politicians and a lack of trust, and I made the joke about promises and heaven. The point about it is, what you need is somebody that's actually got a track record. Someone like myself, for instance, who's campaigned within the local community to stop a local pub with over 1,000 residents from being turned into a Tesco, which has helped save local shops, which has helped a residential mental health centre, for instance, who used to use the pub and still do, luckily now, for instance, for helping them get back into society and for that. So I think that people do want somebody that can say, hand on heart, I tell you what, I will work for you because I've done so already. I will work for you because I can prove it with a track record. And I'm not from London. I've earned my stripes here, and I'd like to take forward the wishes of people because actually that's what I've learnt from living here for 29 years.
Rachel, inside knowledge or outside skills?
Well, I've lived in many places and over many years, and I think that does bring a broad breadth of experience of which you can bring to a city. But I've actually worked in York since 1999 in various capacities. First of all, organising Aviva, one of our biggest companies here within York, and over the years through a national job that I've had, travelled up and down the country, learning experiences in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland and across England, and therefore I would say the richness of experience. And if you want real life experience, I can tell working in the NHS gives you nothing more than real life experience as the work I have been doing over the last 20 years.
Ken, real life experience?
Yes, I'm not a politician. This is the first time I've ever run for any sort of office. My background is 35 years in the international oil and gas business. I've lived in several countries around the world, including the Middle East and New Zealand, in Europe, in the Netherlands. Sorry? No. No, I was born and bred in Leeds and brought up in Leeds, and I've always had connections with York. I've only lived here for the past 6 years, but during that time I've been heavily involved in aspects of the action groups against the local plan and other, local issues. So I think there is an element of, yes, it's good to be familiar with the local area. Maybe it's not absolutely essential, but it certainly has a benefit.
Megan?
Yeah, okay, so I've lived here for 4 years now. I did my full undergrad here and I'm doing my master's, but I think, I've done my fair share of local campaigning as well. I've campaigned on anti-bedroom tax stuff here. I campaigned to save the Castlegate mental health services that are thankfully still open. I've done work on the attempted reinstatement of EMA to the local authority. I have done work in this area just because I've not been here for 10 years. 10 years is a long time as well. I'm not old. I am pretty much destined. No, in the sense of I'm destined to follow jobs around in a very precarious way for the rest of my life. The chances of me being able to put roots in a community for 10 years or more now are incredibly slim. And with the experience that I've had so far,
for putting such a long life sentence on you.
It's going to be very difficult for me to rack that up, but I don't think that means you can say any less that my policies and the reason that I have joined to fight with the trade unionists and socialist coalition are any less based in what I have seen around me living here than anybody else who's been here for a longer time than I have, personally.
I've got a member of the audience who's going to shout something out, I think.
No, I've never said that people... I and UKIP, I've never said that people shouldn't come here to work. We said earlier on when we talked about immigration that we're in favour of immigration. It's not a question of where people come from. It'd be nice if people came from all over the world and bring their own experiences and their valued backgrounds with them. It's just separating the issue of numbers and management of the people that come. And we are finding it very difficult with the sheer volume of people that are coming in. It's only that. We're not against immigration and people coming to work here.
Jonathan was going to...
If I may, yes.
Talk on our...
Thank you. I think that the constituency basis of election in this country is extremely important. It's weakened. There is too much distance, as we talked earlier, between Westminster and the constituencies. But the basic idea seems to me very important, and we should treasure it. But I think very quickly there are broadly 3 functions of a Member of Parliament.
I'm not sure we can have 3 functions.
Can I say them very quickly, because I think it's important when we're discussing this issue.
The children need to go to bed.
One, I think they'd like to stay up a bit longer.
They're falling asleep. Robert, would you like to... Sorry, no, Robert, let's hear your say on local or not local.
Yep. Straight answer, I'm not particularly local. My husband is born in York and was at York University when we met, so I can't quite match Nick's longevity of campaigning here, but I did deliver quite a lot of leaflets in the 2007 elections when he was the candidate, so some connection, but I'm not going to pretend to be local, because I think sincerity in politics is really important, and people shouldn't really try to fake where they're from.
Brilliant. Can I, at that point, say a huge thank you to the panel up here. It's been really good to hear you explain as clearly as you can the different policies. Can I thank you, the audience, for coming along and contributing to this, and some really good questions. I hope that we'll keep the debate going on Twitter, #Bootham Debates. It's been filmed, it now occurs to me, which is a horrifying prospect. If you were so excited by it, or you just want to check out your televisual presentation skills, you can look at it all again on YouTube, apparently, which is a fairly scary opportunity. Can I thank the team of guys at the back? They are guys, I'm sorry, I think. They are guys at the back who worked really hard for organising it, especially the students from Bootham. We've been trying to get everybody involved in the election, and they've really taken to this with great seriousness and enthusiasm, and that has been wonderful to see. But mainly to our candidates, thank you very much indeed, and thank you. Safe journey home.
Well done. Very good work.